My name is Jackson, and for the past 15 years, I've been living on the road as a long-haul trucker. I've seen every stretch of interstate from Maine to California, and I thought I had experienced everything the highway could throw at me. Bad weather, aggressive drivers, mechanical breakdowns, you name it. But what happened to me during a routine cross-country haul in October 2023 still keeps me checking my mirrors every few minutes, even now. It started with what seemed like a perfect job. A freight company out of Denver offered me a high-paying run from Colorado to Jacksonville, Florida. The load was simple: electronics equipment in sealed containers, and the timeline was generous. I'd driven this route dozens of times before, so I figured it would be an easy week on the road with a decent paycheck waiting at the end. I picked up my red Peterbilt from the yard that Tuesday morning, did my pre-trip inspection, and headed east on Interstate 70 with the sun rising behind me. Everything felt normal for the first few hundred miles. The radio was playing classic country, the coffee was hot, and traffic was light. I made good time through Kansas, stopping only for fuel and the mandatory rest breaks. It was somewhere around the Missouri border when I first noticed the black pickup truck. Nothing unusual about that, of course. Pickups are as common as tumbleweeds on the interstate, but this one caught my attention because it seemed to be maintaining the exact same speed as my rig, always staying about a quarter mile behind me. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. Plenty of vehicles match highway speeds with trucks because we tend to drive steady and know the roads. But as I continued through Missouri and into Illinois, the pickup was still there. Same distance, same position, like it was tethered to my trailer by an invisible rope. I started paying closer attention, checking my side mirrors more frequently. The truck was newer, maybe a Chevy Silverado or GMC Sierra, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see the driver. When I stopped at a truck stop outside St. Louis for my mandatory break, I watched the pickup pull into the same lot. It parked near the fuel pumps, but the driver did not get out. He just sat there, engine running, while I grabbed some food and used the restroom. I tried to get a look at him, but the distance and the tinted glass made it impossible to make out any details. Something about the whole situation was making me uneasy, but I could not put my finger on exactly why. I got back in my truck and continued east on Interstate 64. Sure enough, within minutes of pulling back onto the highway, the black pickup was behind me again. This time I was certain it was not coincidence. Someone was following me, and I had no idea why. I tried to think of any reason someone would want to tail a trucker. Maybe it was law enforcement conducting some kind of surveillance, but that did not make sense. Either my logbooks were clean, my cargo was legitimate, and I'd never been involved in anything illegal. As I drove through the night, the pickup maintained its position. I experimented with changing lanes, adjusting my speed, even taking an unexpected exit, and then getting back on the highway. Each time the pickup matched my movements. It was definitely following me, and whoever was driving knew I was aware of it. The whole thing was starting to feel like some twisted game of cat and mouse. I decided to stop at a large truck stop outside Louisville to see what would happen. The place was busy with dozens of rigs parked for the night, and I figured there would be safety in numbers. I backed into a parking space and watched as the pickup pulled into the lot behind me. This time, the driver got out, and what I saw made my blood run cold. He was a tall, thin man, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. But it was not his appearance that scared me. It was what he was doing. He was walking between the parked trucks, approaching other drivers and showing them something on his phone. I could not hear what he was saying, but I watched him talk to 3 different truckers, and each conversation seemed to be about the same thing. He was asking about me. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to channel 19, the main trucking channel. I keyed the mic and said, "This is the driver of the red Peterbilt parked on the north side of the lot. Anyone else getting approached by a guy in a black pickup asking questions?" The response came immediately. "Yeah, driver. He just showed me a picture of your truck. Said he was looking for the guy driving it. Seemed pretty interested in where you might be headed." Another voice crackled through the speaker. "Same here, good buddy. Guy seemed real eager to know your route. I told him I did not know nothing, but he was persistent. My hands were shaking as I put down the microphone. Someone was actively hunting me, and I had no idea who or why. I decided to get out of there immediately. I started my engine and pulled out of the truck stop as quickly as I could safely manage. In my mirrors, I saw the man in dark clothes running back to his pickup. Within minutes, he was behind me again on the highway. But this time, something had changed. He was no longer maintaining that careful quarter-mile distance. He was getting closer. I picked up the CB again and put out a call for help. Breaker 19, this is a red Peterbilt eastbound on 64, mile marker 45. I got a black pickup that has been following me for over 500 miles. Driver is asking questions about me at truck stops. I think I might be in danger here. The responses came flooding in. Truckers offering to convoy with me, suggestions to call the police, warnings about similar incidents other drivers had experienced. That last part caught my attention. What do you mean, similar incidents? I asked. The voice that answered made my skin crawl. There have been stories, driver. Truckers getting followed, stalked. Some of them turned up dead at remote truck stops. Police think it might be the same guy. You need to get somewhere safe, and you need to do it now. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig to the maximum safe speed. The pickup matched my pace, and I could see it was now maybe 100 yards behind me. My destination in Jacksonville was still 400 miles away, but I was not going to make it driving straight through. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I called 911 on my cell phone and explained the situation to the dispatcher. They said they would alert state police along my route, but it could take time for units to respond. In the meantime, they advised me to head for the nearest populated area and avoid isolated stops. The problem was, it was now past midnight, and long stretches of highway between cities were exactly that, isolated. The pickup was getting even closer now, maybe 50 yards behind me. I could see it clearly in my mirrors, and for the first time, I got a good look at the driver. Even in the darkness, I could tell he was staring directly at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. This was not random road rage or mistaken identity. This person had chosen me specifically, and he was closing in for whatever he had planned. I started looking for any opportunity to get off the highway and find help. Gas stations, rest areas, anywhere with people and lights. But every exit I passed was either closed for the night or led to dark rural roads that would leave me even more vulnerable. The pickup driver seemed to know this too. He was herding me away from populated areas, forcing me to continue on the most isolated stretches of highway. Then I saw my chance. About 20 miles ahead was a state police way station that operated 24 hours. If I could make it there, I would be safe. I keyed the CB and announced my plan to any truckers who might be listening. I am heading for the way station at mile marker 78. If anyone is in the area, I could use some backup. The response was immediate. We got you, driver. This is a convoy of 3 rigs about 10 miles behind you. We are pushing hard to catch up. Just keep that shiny side up until we get there. Knowing other truckers were coming to help gave me the courage to keep going. But the pickup was now right on my tail, close enough that I could see the driver clearly in my mirrors. He was young, maybe in his 30s, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to burn with some kind of sick excitement. He kept gesturing at me, making slashing motions across his throat. There was no doubt in my mind that he intended to kill me, and the only thing standing between me and becoming another highway statistic was the distance to that way station. With about 5 miles to go, the pickup made its move. The driver pulled into the left lane and started to pass me, but instead of continuing on, he began trying to force me off the road. He swerved toward my cab, missing by inches, then dropped back and tried again. I fought to keep control of my 80,000-pound rig while this maniac tried to run me into the ditch. I could see the lights of the way station ahead when the pickup driver made his final play. He pulled alongside my cab, and I could see him holding something in his hand. It looked like a gun, and he was pointing it directly at me through his passenger window. Time slowed down as I realized he was about to shoot. I yanked my steering wheel hard to the right, using the mass of my truck to force him toward the median barrier. The pickup hit the concrete barrier at highway speed and bounced back across both lanes before flipping 3 times and coming to rest upside down in the ditch. I pulled into the way station and immediately called for emergency services. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. State police arrived within minutes, followed by an ambulance and fire truck. The pickup driver had not survived the crash, but what they found in his vehicle explained everything. He had detailed maps with truck stops marked, photographs of dozens of different trucks and their drivers, and a notebook filled with license plate numbers and routes. The police said he had been hunting truckers for months, possibly years. They also found newspaper clippings about unsolved murders at truck stops across the Midwest and Southeast. Drivers who had been shot, stabbed, or simply disappeared while on routine hauls. The FBI eventually linked him to at least 8 confirmed kills and suspected he was responsible for many more. I found out later that his name was Michael Crane, and he had been a trucker himself until he was fired for erratic behavior and drug use. Somewhere along the way, he had developed an obsession with killing other drivers, seeing it as some kind of revenge against the industry that had rejected him. He would follow trucks for hundreds of miles, studying their patterns and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The 3 truckers who had been racing to help me arrived at the way station about 20 minutes after the crash. They stayed with me until dawn, making sure I was okay and helping me process what had happened. The brotherhood of the road is real, and that night it saved my life. I eventually completed my delivery to Jacksonville, but the experience changed me forever. I installed additional mirrors on my truck, carry a loaded shotgun in my cab, and I am constantly checking for vehicles that might be following me. The highway is full of predators, and truckers make easy targets because we follow predictable routes and often travel alone. Every time I see a black pickup in my mirrors now, my heart rate spikes. Every time I stop at a truck stop, I scan the parking lot for anyone who might be watching me. The freedom and independence that drew me to trucking in the first place has been replaced by constant vigilance and fear. Michael Crane is dead, but I know there are others out there just like him. Men who see truckers as prey, who study our habits and wait for the perfect moment to strike. We drive the loneliest roads in America, often hundreds of miles from the nearest help, and that isolation makes us vulnerable. I still love the road, but I will never again take for granted that the vehicles behind me are just fellow travelers trying to get somewhere. Some of them are hunters, and if you're not careful, you might just become their next victim. Keep your eyes on those mirrors, drivers, and trust your instincts. Your life might depend on it. My name is Jakai, and I have always been a cautious driver. In my 8 years of long-haul trucking, I have developed strict rules about where I park for the night and what situations I will and will not put myself in. I avoid isolated rest areas. I never park near wooded areas if I can help it, and I always try to stay at well-lit truck stops with plenty of other drivers around. These precautions have served me well and helped me avoid the dangerous situations that some other drivers find themselves in. But sometimes, circumstances beyond your control force you into exactly the kind of situation you have spent years trying to avoid. This story is about one of those times when a combination of bad timing, poor weather, and federal regulations put me in a position where all my careful planning could not protect me from what lurked in the darkness outside my truck. It happened in January 2024, during a run from Minneapolis to Jacksonville. I was hauling frozen foods in a refrigerated trailer, which meant I had to maintain specific temperatures and could not afford delays that might compromise the cargo. The load was time-sensitive, but I was making good progress through the Midwest despite some light snow and icy conditions. The problems started when I hit unexpected traffic delays in southern Illinois due to a multi-vehicle accident that closed the interstate for several hours. By the time traffic started moving again, I was behind schedule and pushing up against my federal driving limits. Truckers are required by law to take 10 consecutive hours off duty after 14 hours of driving, and those regulations are strictly enforced with electronic logging devices that cannot be tampered with. As I crossed into Kentucky, my electronic logs showed that I had less than an hour of driving time left before I would be forced to stop for the mandatory rest period. I started looking for truck stops or rest areas where I could park safely for the night, but the timing was working against me. It was nearly 11 p.m. on a Wednesday night, and most of the truck stops along my route were already full of drivers who had claimed parking spaces earlier in the day. I tried 3 different truck stops over the next 45 minutes, but each one had signs posted indicating "lot full, no overnight parking." This is a common problem for drivers who get delayed during their runs. The best parking spots fill up early, and drivers who arrive late are often forced to park in less desirable locations. With only 10 minutes of driving time left, I was getting desperate. The highway signs indicated a rest area coming up in 5 miles, and even though I preferred not to park in isolated areas, I had no choice. My electronic logs would not allow me to drive past the rest area, and parking on the highway shoulder would be both illegal and dangerous. The rest area was exactly what I had feared. It was a small, poorly lit facility tucked into a grove of pine trees about a quarter mile off the main highway. There were no other trucks parked there, no attendant on duty, and only a few dim security lights that barely illuminated the parking area. The restroom facilities were housed in a small concrete building that looked like it had not been updated since the 1980s, but I had no choice. My electronic logs showed 0 driving time remaining, and continuing would result in serious violations that could cost me my job and my commercial driver's license. I pulled into the rest area and found a parking spot as close to the access road as possible, hoping that staying near the exit would provide some measure of safety. I went through my normal nighttime routine, securing my trailer, checking the refrigeration unit, and doing a walk-around inspection of my truck. The rest area was completely silent except for the hum of my refrigeration unit and the distant sound of traffic on the interstate. The trees surrounding the parking area seemed to absorb sound, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I locked my truck and settled into my sleeper berth around midnight, setting my alarm for 10 a.m. when my required rest period would be complete. Despite my uneasiness about the location, I was exhausted from the long day and the stress of finding parking, so I fell asleep fairly quickly. I was awakened around 2:30 a.m. by a sound that initially confused me. It was the sound of a child screaming, a high-pitched, terrified cry that seemed to be coming from the woods surrounding the rest area. At first, I thought I might have been dreaming, but as I became more alert, I could hear the screams clearly through the walls of my truck. The sound was heartbreaking and urgent, the kind of crying that suggested a child was lost, hurt, or in immediate danger. Every instinct told me I should investigate and try to help, but my experience and training warned me to be cautious. Rest areas like this one were known to be targets for robberies and other crimes, and I had heard stories about criminals using recorded sounds or accomplices to lure unsuspecting victims away from the safety of their vehicles. I opened the curtains in my sleeper berth and looked out toward the woods. The security lights provided limited visibility, but I could see the dark outline of trees about 50 yards from where my truck was parked. The screaming was definitely coming from that direction, and it sounded like it was moving through the forest, sometimes closer and sometimes farther away. I grabbed my flashlight and cell phone, debating whether to call 911 or investigate the situation myself. The screaming continued for about 5 minutes, then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was even more disturbing than the screams had been. Either the child had been found and helped, or something terrible had happened. I called 911 and reported what I had heard, giving the dispatcher the exact location of the rest area and describing the sounds. The dispatcher said they would send a patrol unit to investigate, but warned me that response times to remote rest areas could be lengthy. She advised me to stay in my truck and not investigate on my own. About 20 minutes later, the screaming started again. This time it sounded closer, maybe only 20 or 30 yards from my truck. I turned on my truck's headlights and exterior floodlights, illuminating as much of the surrounding area as possible. The screaming stopped immediately when the lights came on, as if whoever or whatever was making the sound had been startled by the sudden illumination. I kept the lights on and scanned the tree line carefully, looking for any sign of movement or distress. The forest appeared empty and quiet, with no indication that anyone was out there. But I had clearly heard the screaming, and it had definitely been coming from those woods. After about 10 minutes, I turned off the exterior lights to conserve my battery but kept the headlights on and pointed toward the trees. Almost immediately, the screaming resumed, closer than ever. This time, it sounded like multiple voices, adults as well as children, all crying out in what sounded like pain and terror. I turned the lights back on, and once again, the sound stopped instantly. It was clear that whoever was making these sounds did not want to be seen, which reinforced my suspicion that this was some kind of trap or criminal activity. But the sounds were so realistic and distressing that I could not completely dismiss the possibility that real people were in danger. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of turning on all my lights, I used just my flashlight to sweep the tree line. As soon as the beam of light penetrated the darkness between the trees, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were people in the woods, at least 3 or 4 figures standing among the trees about 40 yards from my truck. But something was wrong with the scene. The people appeared to be holding something large and rectangular, and they were positioned in a way that suggested they were trying to hide behind the trees while still having a clear view of my truck. I focused my flashlight beam on the group, and they immediately ducked behind larger trees to avoid the light. But I had seen enough to understand what was happening. The rectangular object they were holding was clearly some kind of speaker or sound system, and they were using it to broadcast recorded screams and cries for help. This was a deliberate trap, designed to lure unsuspecting travelers out of their vehicles and into the woods where they could be robbed, assaulted, or worse. The recorded sounds were professionally done and extremely realistic, but they were not coming from real people in distress. They were coming from criminals who had positioned themselves in the woods around the rest area, waiting for someone to respond to their fake emergency. I immediately called 911 again and reported what I had discovered. I described the people in the woods, their apparent use of sound equipment, and my belief that this was a criminal operation targeting travelers at the rest area. The dispatcher took my report seriously and said multiple patrol units were being dispatched to the location. While I was on the phone with 911, I heard a loud thump against the side of my truck. Someone had thrown something at my trailer, probably trying to get my attention or intimidate me into coming outside. I told the dispatcher about this development and was advised to stay locked in my cab and keep my engine running in case I needed to leave quickly. Over the next few minutes, I could see movement in the trees on both sides of the rest area. The criminals had apparently realized that their trap was not working and were repositioning themselves around my truck. I saw at least one person cross the parking lot in the darkness, trying to approach my truck from the blind spot behind my trailer. I started my engine and turned on all my exterior lights, flooding the entire rest area with bright white light. This clearly frustrated the criminals because I could see them retreating deeper into the woods where the light did not penetrate. But they did not leave entirely. They seemed to be waiting for me to turn off the lights or for some other opportunity to continue their attack. About 15 minutes later, I saw the flashing lights of police vehicles approaching the rest area. 3 patrol cars arrived simultaneously, and the officers immediately began searching the woods with powerful flashlights. I heard shouting from the direction of the trees, followed by the sound of people crashing through the underbrush as they tried to escape. The police officers called out commands for the suspects to stop and surrender, but it was clear that the criminals were fleeing through the dense forest. 2 of the officers pursued them on foot, while the third remained to take my statement and secured the rest area. The officer who interviewed me said this type of crime was becoming more common at isolated rest areas and truck stops. Criminals would use recorded sounds, fake emergencies, or other tactics to lure drivers away from their vehicles where they could be robbed or carjacked. The speaker equipment and realistic sound effects made their traps very convincing, especially for drivers who were tired or disoriented from long hours on the road. The officer also told me that I had handled the situation correctly by staying in my truck, using my lights to investigate rather than getting out, and calling for help rather than trying to deal with the situation myself. He said that drivers who responded to these fake emergencies often ended up being victims of violent crimes. The police search of the woods revealed evidence of the criminal operation. They found the speaker equipment that had been used to broadcast the fake screams, along with camping gear that suggested the criminals had been operating from the rest area for several days. They also discovered items that appeared to have been stolen from other travelers, including wallets, cell phones, and personal belongings. The suspects were not apprehended that night, but the officer said the evidence would help them build a case and potentially identify the criminals through DNA analysis and other forensic techniques. He warned me that similar groups were operating at rest areas throughout the region and advised all drivers to be extremely cautious when parking in isolated locations. I spent the remainder of the night at the rest area, but I kept my truck running and my lights on until dawn. The police maintained a presence at the location until morning, which made me feel safer, but I was still on edge every time I heard any sound from the woods. The next day, I reported the incident to my dispatcher and the trucking company's safety department. They added the rest area to their list of locations that drivers should avoid when possible, and distributed information about the incident to other drivers in the fleet. I also shared my experience on CB radio and trucking forums, warning other drivers about the dangers of responding to apparent emergencies at isolated rest areas. The story spread quickly through the trucking community, and several other drivers contacted me with similar experiences at different locations. Since that night, I've become even more cautious about where I park and how I respond to unusual situations. I carry additional emergency equipment in my truck, including an air horn, pepper spray, and a baseball bat. I also make sure my cell phone is always fully charged and that I have emergency contacts programmed for quick access. The experience taught me that not every cry for help is genuine, and that criminals are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their methods. The fake emergency at the rest area was expertly crafted to prey on the natural instincts of drivers to help people in distress, but responding to it could have resulted in serious injury or death. I still drive through that area regularly, but I never stop at that rest area again. Every time I pass it, I think about those people in the woods with their speaker system, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to fall for their trap. The sound of those fake screams still haunts me, not because they were real, but because of how realistic they were and how close I came to walking into a deadly situation. The highway can be a dangerous place, but sometimes the greatest threats come from people who exploit our desire to help others. Trust your instincts, stay alert, and remember that not every emergency you encounter is real. The sound in the woods might be someone who genuinely needs help, but it might also be predators using your compassion against you. Jakai, signing off, and remember that the woods have ears, and the screams you hear might not always be real. Stay safe out there, drivers. My name is Princeton, and I have been driving for about 3 years now. I'm still newer to this than a lot of the veterans you hear from on the CB, and I was always nervous about those late-night runs through unfamiliar territory. Most of my experience was with daytime hauls, predictable routes between major cities. But the freight company I work for started offering me better-paying runs that required overnight driving. The money was good enough that I could not turn it down, even though something about driving alone through the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. always made me uneasy. This particular story happened in March 2023, and it started like any other routine delivery. I picked up a sealed trailer at a distribution center outside Phoenix. The paperwork was straightforward, just listed the cargo as mixed electronics and household goods, destination Atlanta. The trailer was already loaded and sealed when I got there, which was normal for these kinds of runs. The dispatcher handed me the manifest. I did my pre-trip inspection, and I was on the road by noon. The first part of the drive was uneventful. I made good time through Arizona and New Mexico, stopped for fuel and food at the usual truck stops, and everything felt normal. I had driven this route before, mostly during the day, but the timing worked out that I would be crossing through Texas and Louisiana overnight. That was fine with me. Less traffic, cooler temperatures, and I actually liked the peacefulness of night driving once I got used to it. It was somewhere around 1 a.m., just outside of Abilene, Texas, when I first heard the sound. I was cruising along Interstate 20, listening to some late-night talk radio, when I heard what sounded like muffled voices coming from behind me. At first, I thought it was the radio, maybe picking up some interference from another station. But when I turned the volume down, the sounds were still there. I pulled over at the next truck stop to check it out. The place was mostly empty. Just a few rigs parked for the night, and the usual collection of night shift workers and insomniacs grabbing coffee and snacks. I walked around my trailer, listening carefully, but everything seemed quiet. I checked the seal on the back doors, and it looked intact. No signs of tampering, no obvious damage. I figured maybe I had been hearing road noise or something from the truck itself. I got back on the highway and continued east, but about an hour later, I heard the sounds again. This time they were clearer, definitely human voices, and they seemed to be coming from inside my trailer. My heart started racing as I realized what that might mean. Someone was in my cargo area, and they were not supposed to be there. I found another truck stop about 20 miles down the road and pulled in. This one was busier, with better lighting and more people around. I felt safer investigating with other drivers nearby. I walked around to the back of my trailer and listened. The voices were definitely coming from inside, muffled but clearly audible. I could make out at least 2 different people, maybe more. I called the dispatcher on duty, explained what was happening, and asked what I should do. The guy on the phone seemed confused, said that was not something he had dealt with before, and told me to call the police. But before I could hang up, I heard someone banging on the inside of the trailer. Loud, metallic sounds like they were hitting the walls with something hard. That is when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of opening the trailer myself, I called 911 immediately. I told the dispatcher that I had people trapped in my trailer and needed police and paramedics at my location. While I was on the phone, the banging got louder and more desperate. I could hear multiple voices now, yelling and screaming, but I could not make out what they were saying. The state police arrived within 15 minutes, followed by sheriff deputies and an ambulance. I explained the situation to the officers, showed them my paperwork, and told them I had no idea how anyone could have gotten into a sealed trailer. They asked me to step back while they investigated, and I was grateful not to be the one opening those doors. When they cut the seal and opened the trailer, what they found was not what any of us expected. There were 3 people inside, 2 men and 1 woman, all in their 20s or early 30s. But they were not victims. They were armed with knives and what looked like a homemade club, and they came out of that trailer ready to fight. The police had their weapons drawn immediately, shouting for the 3 people to drop their weapons and get on the ground. It was chaos for a few minutes, with everyone yelling and the suspects trying to figure out what was happening. Eventually, they complied and were taken into custody. but I could see the confusion on everyone's faces. These people were not refugees or trafficking victims. They were something else entirely. During the interviews that followed, the truth came out, and it was worse than I could have imagined. The 3 individuals had used my truck as part of an elaborate human trafficking operation. They had been hiding in the trailer when it was loaded, planning to use the long-haul trip to transport other victims who were supposed to be picked up at various stops along the route. The plan was for me to make specific stops at predetermined locations, where additional people would be loaded into the trailer without my knowledge. The 3 in my trailer were the handlers, armed and ready to control the victims during transport. They had supplies, restraints, and weapons, and they were prepared to spend days inside that trailer managing human cargo. But something had gone wrong with their plan. The pickup locations had been compromised, either by law enforcement or rival traffickers, and no additional victims were loaded. The 3 handlers found themselves trapped in my trailer with no way to communicate with their contacts on the outside. They had been in there for over 12 hours when I first heard them, and they were getting desperate. The FBI took over the investigation, and over the next several weeks, I learned the full scope of what I had been unknowingly involved in. The freight company I worked for was legitimate, but someone had infiltrated their dispatch system and created fake loads specifically for trafficking operations. My truck had been targeted because of my route and timing, and I had been chosen because I was inexperienced enough that I might not notice irregularities. The investigation revealed a network that spanned multiple states, using legitimate trucking operations as cover for moving people across the country. They had been operating for years, corrupting dispatch systems, bribing warehouse workers, and exploiting drivers who thought they were hauling normal freight. I was not the first driver who had been used this way, just the first one who had discovered the truth before delivery. The 3 people in my trailer were eventually charged with human trafficking, kidnapping conspiracy, and weapons violations. During their trials, more details came out about the operation. They had been planning to pick up 6 victims, mostly young women, who had been lured with promises of legitimate work in other cities. Instead, they would have been forced into prostitution or labor trafficking. The woman, whose name was Sarah Chen, turned out to be the leader of this particular cell. She had been convicted of similar crimes in California and had jumped bail before fleeing to Texas. The 2 men were both illegal immigrants who had been coerced into working for the trafficking ring after being threatened with deportation. Their stories were complicated, and while they were clearly involved in something horrible, they were also victims of the same system they were perpetuating. As for me, I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the experience changed everything about how I approached this job. I installed additional security measures on my truck, including cameras that monitor my trailer and GPS tracking that alerts me to any unauthorized stops. I also joined several online forums where drivers share information about suspicious activity and potential trafficking operations. The freight company implemented new security protocols as well. All loads are now verified through multiple channels. Dispatch communications are recorded and monitored, and drivers are trained to recognize signs of criminal activity. But the scary truth is that traffickers are constantly evolving their methods, and the trucking industry remains vulnerable because of the sheer volume of freight moving across the country every day. I still think about those 3 people and what would have happened if their plan had worked. 6 innocent victims would have been loaded into my trailer at various stops, and I would have unknowingly transported them to whatever hell awaited them in Atlanta. The handlers were prepared for a multi-day journey with human cargo, and the weapons they carried suggested they were ready to use violence to maintain control. The psychological impact of this incident was significant. I developed anxiety about sealed loads, especially overnight runs through unfamiliar areas. For months afterward, I would pull over at every truck stop to listen for sounds from my trailer. I installed sound monitoring equipment so I could hear if anything was happening in my cargo area while I was driving. The FBI agent who debriefed me said that truck drivers are often the first line of defense against human trafficking because we spend so much time on the road and see patterns that others might miss. He gave me a card with a hotline number and urged me to call if I ever noticed anything suspicious. The responsibility felt overwhelming, knowing that my job could put me in contact with such horrible crimes. I learned that human trafficking is much more common than most people realize, especially in the trucking industry. Traffickers use trucks because they can move people across state lines quickly and efficiently, often hiding victims in plain sight among legitimate cargo. The victims are usually too scared or controlled to call for help, and by the time anyone realizes what is happening, they are hundreds of miles from where they started. The trial lasted 8 months, and I had to testify several times about what I had heard and seen that night. Sarah Chen received a 20-year sentence, while the 2 men got shorter sentences in exchange for cooperating with the investigation. Their testimony helped law enforcement identify and shut down several other trafficking operations across the Southwest. But the network they were part of was much larger than just those 3 individuals. The FBI said they had identified at least 12 other drivers who had been used to transport victims, most of whom never realized what they were carrying. Some loads contained people hidden among legitimate cargo. Others involved modified trailers with concealed compartments. And some operations simply relied on drivers who were paid not to ask questions. The scariest part was learning how sophisticated these operations had become. They used technology to track law enforcement movements, monitored CB radio chatter to identify potential threats, and had contacts within trucking companies who could provide inside information. They knew which routes were safest, which truck stops were monitored, and which drivers could be trusted or corrupted. Since that night, I have encountered other drivers who have had similar experiences. There is an informal network of truckers who share information about suspicious loads, unusual requests from dispatch, and potential trafficking indicators. We look out for each other and report anything that seems off to the authorities. The experience also made me more aware of the people I see at truck stops, especially those who seem out of place or distressed. I have learned to recognize signs that someone might be a trafficking victim, people who seem scared or disoriented, individuals who are not allowed to speak for themselves, or groups where one person controls all the identification documents. I still drive nights, and I still take long-haul loads, but I'm much more vigilant now. Every trailer I pick up gets a thorough inspection, every unusual sound gets investigated, and every dispatcher request gets verified through multiple channels. The money is good, and I love the freedom of the road, but I know that my truck could be targeted again by people who see transportation as a way to move human beings like cargo. The trucking industry has made progress in fighting human trafficking, but criminals are always adapting. New methods emerge regularly, and drivers like me have to stay informed and alert. We carry more than just freight across these highways. Sometimes we carry people's lives and futures, and that responsibility weighs on me every time I climb into my cab. Princeton signing off. And remember, if something does not feel right about your load, trust your instincts and call for help. The victims, depending on us, might not be able to call for themselves. My name is Jason, and I have been driving solo long haul for 10 years now. I love the independence of being on my own, setting my own pace, and not having to deal with team drivers who might have different habits or schedules than me. Most of the time, the solitude is exactly what I need after spending my off-duty time with family and friends. But there are stretches of highway, especially late at night, where being alone starts to feel different. Less peaceful, more vulnerable. This story takes place on a route I had driven dozens of times before, but never quite like this. It was September 2023, and I was hauling auto parts from Detroit to New Orleans. The load was time-sensitive but not urgent. which meant I could take my time and drive during daylight hours if I wanted to. But the timing worked out that I would be crossing through Mississippi in the early morning hours, and I actually preferred driving that stretch at night when traffic was lighter. I had made good time through Tennessee and was feeling relaxed as I crossed into Mississippi around 2 a.m. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional truck or late-night traveler heading south. I was listening to an old country station that came in clear despite being in the middle of nowhere, and everything felt normal. I had about 4 hours of driving left before I would need to take my mandatory break, and the road conditions were perfect. It was somewhere around mile marker 47 on Interstate 55, south of Jackson when I first saw her. A woman standing on the side of the highway with her thumb out, the universal sign for needing a ride. This was not unusual in itself. You see hitchhikers regularly in trucking, especially on rural highways where other transportation options are limited. But something about this particular woman caught my attention immediately. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair and wearing what looked like a white dress or blouse. Even in the darkness, she seemed to glow slightly in my headlights as I passed. I got a clear look at her face for just a moment, and she looked directly at me with eyes that seemed desperate and pleading. My first instinct was to stop and help, but company policy strictly prohibited picking up hitchhikers, and I had learned over the years that stopping for strangers on isolated highways could be dangerous. I passed her and continued south, but the image of her face stayed with me. She looked so young and vulnerable, standing alone in the darkness miles from anywhere. I started second-guessing my decision not to stop. Maybe I should have at least called 911 to report someone stranded on the highway. But it was too late now, and I was already several miles past where I'd seen her. About 15 minutes later, near mile marker 32, I saw her again. The same woman, same white clothing, same desperate expression, standing on the shoulder with her thumb out. My heart started racing as I realized this was impossible. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. I was traveling at highway speed on a route with no parallel roads, and I had not seen any other vehicles that could have given her a ride. I slowed down as I approached her this time, staring intently to make sure I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. It was definitely the same person, in the exact same pose, looking directly at me as I passed. But this time, something was different about her appearance. She seemed less solid somehow, more translucent, like I was looking at her through water or fog. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to channel 19, the main trucking channel. Breaker 19, this is Midnight Runner southbound on 55 approaching mile marker 30. Anyone else seeing a female hitchhiker out here tonight? The response came immediately from another driver somewhere behind me. Yeah, driver, I just passed a gal in white about 10 miles back. Figured you might have seen her too. Strange to see someone out here alone this time of night. That confirmed I was not hallucinating, but it made the situation even more confusing. If other drivers were seeing her too, then she was real. But how was she appearing at multiple locations along the highway? I tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe there were multiple women, or maybe she had some kind of transportation I had not noticed. But deep down, I knew something was not right about this situation. I continued south, checking my mirrors constantly and scanning the roadside ahead. About 10 miles later, near mile marker 22, there she was again. Same woman, same white dress, same pleading expression. This time, I was ready for her, and I studied her carefully as I approached. As my headlights illuminated her, I could see that she was definitely not entirely solid. I could make out the outline of trees and guardrail behind her, as if she was partially transparent. I keyed the CB radio again. Midnight Runner to any southbound traffic. I need someone to confirm what I'm seeing at mile marker 22. There is a woman in white on the shoulder, but something is not right about her. A gravelly voice responded immediately. Roger that, Midnight Runner. I see her too. Passed her about 20 minutes ago near mile marker 40. Same gal, I am sure of it. This is my third time seeing her tonight on this stretch. The voice continued. "Driver, I have been running this route for 15 years, and I see her probably 4 or 5 times a year. Always the same stretch of highway, always the same appearance. Local drivers call her the Highway Angel. Legend is she died in a car crash somewhere around here back in the 1980s, and she appears to warn truckers about dangerous road conditions ahead." My hand started shaking on the steering wheel as I processed what I was hearing. I was seeing a ghost, and apparently it was a well-known phenomenon among drivers who regularly traveled this route. I had never heard stories about paranormal experiences from other truckers, but then again, most drivers probably would not advertise encounters with supernatural entities. I asked the other driver for more details. "What kind of dangerous conditions is she supposed to warn about?" The response made my blood run cold. "Usually accidents, driver. Bad wrecks involving trucks, often with fatalities. When drivers report seeing her multiple times in one night like this, something bad usually happens within the next few hours on this stretch of highway." I immediately started driving more defensively, reducing my speed and increasing my following distance behind other vehicles. The highway still seemed normal, with light traffic and good visibility, but I was now hyper-aware of every car, every curve, every potential hazard. If this ghostly woman was trying to warn me about something, I wanted to be prepared. About 30 minutes later, I saw her for the 4th time. This time, she was not standing on the shoulder asking for a ride. She was in the middle of the highway, facing oncoming traffic, with both arms raised as if trying to stop vehicles. I slammed on my brakes and came to a complete stop, just a few feet from where she was standing. Other vehicles behind me were also braking hard, and I could hear the sound of air brakes hissing in the night. As I sat there with my truck stopped in the middle of the interstate, the woman looked directly at me through my windshield. Her expression was no longer pleading or desperate. Instead, she looked sad but determined, like someone delivering a message they knew would not be welcome. She pointed ahead of me, down the highway into the darkness, then slowly faded away until she was completely gone. I put my truck in gear and crept forward slowly, not sure what I was going to find, but certain it would be something terrible. About a quarter mile ahead, just around a gradual curve, I saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. A massive accident was blocking both southbound lanes, involving multiple vehicles, including at least 2 other trucks. State police were directing traffic to the shoulder to squeeze past the accident scene. As I inched by, I could see that the wreck was fresh, probably only minutes old. Emergency crews were still working to extract people from the vehicles, and there were ambulances everywhere. If I had been traveling at normal highway speed, I would have come around that curve at 70 miles per hour and slammed into the back of the accident scene. I pulled over at the next truck stop and called 911 to report what I had witnessed. The dispatcher told me that multiple vehicles had already been involved in secondary crashes because drivers came around the curve too fast to stop safely. Several people had been seriously injured, and at least 1 fatality had been confirmed. The accident had happened just minutes before I arrived at the scene. I also called the state police to report the other drivers who had been communicating with me on the CB radio in case they needed witnesses for the accident investigation. But when the officers took my statement, they told me something that made my skin crawl. No other trucks had been reported in the area at the time I claimed to be talking to them on the radio. The accident scene showed no evidence of other commercial vehicles stopping or avoiding the crash. I provided them with the CB handle of the driver who had told me about the Highway Angel, but they said they had no record of that call sign or any radio traffic matching my description. According to their investigation, I was the only truck driver who had managed to avoid becoming part of the accident, and my sudden deceleration had been captured on traffic cameras, but could not be explained by any visible road hazard. The investigation into the original accident revealed that it had been caused by a drunk driver who crossed the median and hit an oncoming car head-on. The secondary crashes happened because the accident occurred just around a curve where oncoming traffic could not see the wreckage until it was too late to stop. Multiple vehicles had piled into the scene, creating a chain reaction that blocked both lanes. I spent the rest of that night at the truck stop, too shaken to continue driving. I called my dispatcher to report the delay and tried to process what had happened. I had seen a ghost, communicated with other drivers who may or may not have been real, and been warned about an accident that saved my life and possibly prevented me from causing additional casualties. Over the next few days, I did some research into the history of that stretch of highway. I found newspaper articles from 1987 about a fatal car accident involving a young woman named Rebecca Martinez. She had been driving home from her job at a diner when her car broke down during a thunderstorm. While walking along the highway trying to find help, she was struck and killed by a drunk driver who fled the scene. The articles described Rebecca as a 23-year-old with long dark hair who was wearing her white work uniform when she died. The accident happened at mile marker 25, right in the middle of the area where I had been seeing the hitchhiker. According to the reports, her body was found several hundred yards from where her car had broken down, suggesting she had been walking along the highway seeking assistance when she was killed. Local newspaper archives contain several stories over the years about drivers reporting sightings of a woman in white along that stretch of highway, always in connection with serious accidents or dangerous road conditions. The phenomenon had been documented since the early 1990s, just a few years after Rebecca's death. I also found online forums where truck drivers shared stories about supernatural encounters on various highways across the country. The thread about Highway 55 in Mississippi contained dozens of accounts similar to mine. Drivers described seeing the same woman, receiving warnings about road hazards, and avoiding accidents because they slowed down or stopped after encountering her. Some of the stories were eerily similar to my experience. Multiple drivers reported seeing her at several locations during a single trip, communicating with other truckers on CB radio who provided background information about her, and discovering later that no other drivers had been in the area during their reported radio conversations. It seemed that Rebecca was not just appearing to individual drivers, but creating entire scenarios designed to get their attention and make them slow down. I returned to that route several times over the following months, always during daylight hours. I never saw Rebecca again, but I always slowed down when passing mile marker 25 and kept a close eye on road conditions in that area. Other drivers on the CB radio occasionally mentioned seeing her, usually late at night and always in connection with hazardous driving conditions. The experience changed how I think about the highway and the people who have died on it over the years. Every mile of interstate has a history, often involving tragedy and loss. Some of those who died may have left something behind, a presence that continues to look out for the living and try to prevent others from suffering the same fate. I started carrying a small photo of Rebecca Martinez in my cab, printed from one of the newspaper articles about her death. She was beautiful and young, with the same kind eyes I had seen that night on the highway. Looking at her picture reminds me that she was a real person with hopes and dreams, not just a ghost story or urban legend. Rebecca Martinez died trying to get help on a dark highway in 1987, but she is still out there helping people more than 35 years later. She saved my life, and possibly the lives of other drivers who might have been involved in that accident. I do not understand how or why she appears to truckers, but I am grateful that she does. Every time I drive past mile marker 25 now, I say a quiet thank you to Rebecca and keep my eyes open for other drivers who might need the same warning she gave me. The highway can be a dangerous place, but sometimes the dangers come with their own protection, watching over us from beyond the grave and guiding us safely through the darkness. If you are ever driving through Mississippi on Interstate 55 late at night and you see a young woman in white asking for a ride, do not stop to pick her up. Instead, slow down, pay attention to road conditions ahead, and be ready for anything. Rebecca Martinez is still out there, still trying to prevent the kind of tragedy that took her own life, and she might just save yours too. JC on, signing off, And remember to keep your eyes open for the highway angel. She is watching out for all of us. My name is Jason, and up until 6 months ago, I always ran team with my partner Marcus. We had been driving together for 8 years, splitting the driving duties and keeping each other company on those long hauls across the country. Marcus was like a brother to me, and having someone else in the cab made those endless miles feel less isolating. But when Marcus decided to retire early after his wife got sick, I found myself running solo for the first time in nearly a decade. I was nervous about driving alone, especially on the overnight shifts that had always been Marcus's specialty. He was a natural night owl who could stay alert and focused during those dangerous hours between midnight and dawn when most accidents happen. I had always taken the day shifts, so suddenly being responsible for nighttime driving felt overwhelming and unfamiliar. This story takes place in October 2023, during my 3rd week of solo driving. I was hauling electronics from Portland to Denver, a route Marcus and I had run probably 50 times together, but doing it alone felt completely different, like I was seeing the highway for the first time. Every shadow looked threatening, every strange sound made me jump, and the endless darkness outside my windows seemed to press in on the cab like a living thing. I'd made good time through Oregon and was crossing into Idaho around 11 p.m. when I first noticed the other truck. It was running parallel to me on the eastbound lanes of Interstate 84, maybe a quarter mile behind, and matching my speed exactly. At first, I did not think much of it. Trucks often maintain similar speeds on long straightaways, especially when trying to make good time on a schedule. But as I continued east through the Snake River Valley, the other truck stayed in exactly the same position relative to my rig. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down for construction zones or steep grades, it slowed down too. After about an hour of this synchronized driving, I started paying closer attention to the truck in my mirrors. What I saw made me do a double take. The truck appeared to be an older model Peterbilt, probably from the 1980s based on the distinctive cab design and proportions. But something was off about its appearance. Even in the darkness, I could tell the paint job was faded and weathered in a way that suggested decades of hard use. The chrome exhaust stacks that should have gleamed in my headlights looked tarnished and dull. More disturbing was the way the truck seemed to blend into the darkness around it. While my own rig was clearly illuminated by streetlights and other vehicles, the shadow truck appeared partially transparent, like I was looking at it through smoke or fog. Its headlights were visible but dim, casting weak pools of yellowish light that seemed to be swallowed up by the night. I tried to get a better look by adjusting my mirrors and even slowing down to let the truck catch up, but it maintained that exact quarter-mile distance no matter what I did. It was like the truck was tethered to mine by some invisible connection, doomed to follow the same path at the same speed forever. I grabbed my CB radio and switched to channel 19 to see if I could make contact with the other driver. Breaker 19. This is solo runner eastbound on 84. Mile marker 200 at 95. Got a Peterbilt running parallel to me, wondering if you copy. I waited for a response, but heard only static. I tried several more times over the next 20 minutes, but the other truck never responded. As we continued through Idaho, I started noticing other strange things about the shadow truck. It never seemed to need fuel, never took rest breaks, and never varied its speed even on steep mountain grades where most trucks would slow down or speed up. It just maintained that steady pace, always staying in the same position relative to my truck, like a reflection that had somehow gotten loose from its mirror. Around 1 a.m., we crossed into Utah, and I decided to test something. I took an exit for a truck stop, curious to see what the shadow truck would do. As I slowed down and moved onto the off-ramp, I watched my mirrors carefully. The other truck continued straight on the interstate, finally breaking the pattern that had persisted for over 2 hours. I felt a mixture of relief and disappointment as I pulled into the truck stop parking lot. Maybe I had been imagining things, letting the stress of solo driving play tricks on my mind. I fueled up, grabbed some coffee and snacks, and took a mandatory 30-minute break to clear my head and refocus on the road ahead. When I got back on the interstate, I felt better and more alert. The caffeine was kicking in, and having other people at the truck stop had reminded me that I was not completely alone out there. I accelerated up to highway speed and settled in for the long climb through the Wasatch Mountains toward Salt Lake City. But 20 minutes later, I saw the headlights in my mirror again. The shadow truck was back, in exactly the same position as before, matching my speed and maintaining that quarter-mile distance. My heart started racing as I realized that whatever was driving that truck had somehow known which route I would take and had been waiting for me to return to the highway. I keyed the CB radio again, this time on the emergency channel. Mayday, this is Solo Runner eastbound on I-80, mile marker 15. I have a truck that has been following me for over 200 miles. Driver is not responding to radio calls and maintaining suspicious distance, requesting assistance. The response came immediately from a dispatcher somewhere in Utah. Solo Runner, this is Salt Lake Dispatch. Are you reporting aggressive or threatening behavior from another commercial vehicle? I tried to explain the situation, but as I talked, I realized how crazy it sounded. A truck that looked old and faded, appeared semi-transparent, never needed fuel stops, and had somehow caught up to me after I took an exit. The dispatcher asked for the other truck's license plate number and DOT information, but I had to admit I could not read either in the darkness. Solo Runner, we show only one commercial vehicle in your area on our traffic monitoring systems. Are you sure you are seeing another truck? The dispatcher's question sent chills down my spine. If their systems only showed my truck, then what was I seeing in my mirrors? I continued east toward Salt Lake City, checking my mirrors obsessively and trying to make sense of what was happening. The shadow truck stayed in position, never getting closer or farther away, like it was locked onto my truck by some supernatural force. As we climbed through the mountains, I started thinking about Marcus and all the stories he used to tell about strange things he had seen during his night shifts. Marcus had always claimed that certain highways were haunted, that the spirits of drivers who had died in accidents continued to travel the same routes they had driven in life. I had dismissed these stories as the product of too many lonely nights and too much caffeine, but now I was starting to wonder if he had been telling the truth. I decided to try something Marcus had mentioned in one of his ghost stories. I reached over and turned on my interior lights, then held up a photo of Marcus and me that I kept on the dashboard. If this was some kind of supernatural encounter, maybe showing respect for my former driving partner would help somehow. The moment I held up the photo, the shadow truck's headlights flashed 3 times, the traditional trucker greeting. My hands started shaking as I realized that whatever was driving that truck was acknowledging my gesture. I flashed my own headlights in response, and the shadow truck flashed back immediately. I grabbed the CB radio one more time, but instead of calling for help, I tried a different approach. Shadow truck running parallel to Solo Runner. This is Jason, and I used to run team with Marcus Williams. If you copy this transmission, please flash your lights twice. The response was immediate. 2 bright flashes from the shadow truck's headlights. Shadow truck, are you Marcus? I asked, my voice shaking. 3 flashes this time, which in trucker code meant negative or no. I tried again. Shadow truck, did you know Marcus Williams? This time, a single long flash, which meant yes or affirmative. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes as I realized I was communicating with the ghost of someone Marcus had known, probably someone who had died on this route and was now watching over other drivers. Shadow truck, are you trying to tell me something about the road ahead? The response was immediate and alarming. The shadow truck's headlights began flashing rapidly, almost strobing, and for the first time since I had noticed it, the truck started changing position. It moved, closer to the median then back toward the shoulder, weaving slightly, as if trying to get my attention. I slowed down and started scanning the road ahead for hazards. The highway looked clear, with good visibility and light traffic, but I trusted the warning I was receiving. About 5 miles later, I crested a hill and saw the flashing lights of emergency vehicles in the distance. A massive accident was blocking both eastbound lanes, involving multiple vehicles including what looked like a jackknifed semi-truck. If I had been traveling at normal highway speed, I would have come over that hill and slammed into the back of the accident scene with little time to react. But because the shadow truck had warned me, I was able to slow down gradually and stop safely behind the growing line of traffic. I looked in my mirrors to thank the shadow truck, but it was gone. The road behind me was empty, with no sign of the mysterious Peterbilt that had been following me for hours. I sat in the stopped traffic for over an hour while emergency crews cleared the accident, but the shadow truck never reappeared. When traffic finally started moving again, I continued toward Salt Lake City with a new appreciation for the supernatural protection that seemed to watch over truck drivers. I called Marcus the next morning and told him about my experience. He was quiet for a long time, then said he had seen the same shadow truck on that exact stretch of highway 3 times during his career. According to Marcus, the truck belonged to a driver named Eddie Thompson, who had been killed in a head-on collision on I-80 in 1987. Eddie had been driving solo after his regular partner quit, just like I was, and he had fallen asleep at the wheel during an overnight run. His truck crossed the median and hit an oncoming car, killing Eddie and a family of 4. Marcus said Eddie's ghost truck appeared to solo drivers who were making their first runs without a partner, especially on overnight shifts when fatigue and loneliness made accidents more likely. The shadow truck would follow new solo drivers through dangerous stretches of highway, watching for hazards and warning them about accidents or other dangers ahead. I researched Eddie Thompson's accident when I got home and found newspaper articles confirming Marcus's story. Eddie had been 34 years old when he died, a veteran driver with over 1 million safe miles who'd never had a serious accident before. The crash happened at 3 a.m. during his second week of solo driving after his longtime partner retired. The articles described Eddie as a safety-conscious driver who was known for helping other truckers and maintaining radio contact with fellow drivers during long hauls. Even in death, it seemed, he was continuing to look out for others who found themselves in similar situations. Over the next several months, I drove that route between Portland and Denver many times, always alone and often during overnight hours. I never saw the shadow truck again, but I always kept an eye out for it. Other solo drivers I met at truck stops had similar stories about supernatural encounters on various highways, usually involving the ghosts of drivers who had died in accidents and continued to watch over the living. These experiences changed how I think about solo driving. While I still miss having Marcus as a partner, I no longer feel completely alone on those long midnight runs. There are others out there, both living and dead, who understand the challenges and dangers of life on the road. We look out for each other in whatever way we can, even if that means crossing back from the other side to flash a warning about hazards ahead. I keep Eddie Thompson's story in mind whenever I encounter a new solo driver who seems nervous or uncertain. I make sure to check on them over the CB radio, share information about road conditions, and remind them that they are part of a community that extends beyond the boundaries between life and death. The highway can be a lonely and dangerous place, but it is also full of guardian angels who continue to drive their routes long after their earthly journey has ended. Eddie Thompson is still out there on I-80, still watching over solo drivers who need guidance and protection during their most vulnerable moments on the road. If you ever find yourself driving alone through Utah on Interstate 80 and you notice an old Peterbilt maintaining distance in your mirrors, do not be afraid. Eddie is just making sure you make it home safely, carrying on the tradition of truckers looking out for each other that transcends even death itself. Jason, signing off, and remember that no driver is ever truly alone as long as the shadow truck is watching over us. My name is Sam, and I have been a CB radio enthusiast for as long as I have been driving trucks. While most drivers these days rely on cell phones and GPS systems, I still keep my CB radio tuned to channel 19 and several other frequencies throughout my shifts. There is something comforting about the chatter of other drivers, the shared information about road conditions and speed traps, and the sense of community that comes from being part of the trucking brotherhood over the airwaves. I drive mostly overnight shifts, hauling freight between Memphis and Atlanta on a regular route that I have been running for 7 years. The overnight hours are quieter on the radio, with fewer drivers chatting and more time between transmissions. But I like the peaceful nature of night driving, and I have always been a bit of an insomniac anyway, so the schedule works well for me. This story begins in November 2023 during what should have been a routine overnight run. I had loaded a trailer full of automotive parts in Memphis and was heading southeast toward Atlanta on Interstate 78. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time. I had my CB radio scanning multiple channels as usual, listening for traffic updates and occasional conversations between other drivers. Around 1 a.m., somewhere between Tupelo and Birmingham, I started picking up unusual transmissions on channel 19. At first, they sounded like normal CB chatter, just difficult to understand because of static and poor signal quality. But as I listened more carefully, I realized the voices were saying things that did not make sense in the context of normal truck driver communications. The first transmission I clearly understood came through around 1:15 a.m. A male voice, distorted by static but audible, said, "This is Phantom Rider, requesting immediate assistance at mile marker 247. We have multiple casualties and need medical evacuation." I grabbed my microphone and responded, "Phantom Rider, this is Night Owl at mile marker 251. I do not see any accidents or emergency vehicles. What is your exact location and nature of emergency?" There was no response to my transmission, but about 10 minutes later, the same voice came through again. "Phantom Rider to any unit. We are trapped in the wreckage and cannot get out. Fire is spreading to the fuel tank. Please hurry." This time, several other drivers on the channel responded, asking for more details and offering to assist. But again, there was no reply from Phantom Rider. I pulled over at the next truck stop and walked around the parking lot, asking other drivers if they had heard the strange transmissions. Most of them had not heard anything unusual, but one older driver named Carlos said he had been picking up weird radio traffic for the past hour. According to Carlos, he had heard voices calling for help, reporting accidents that did not exist, and discussing road conditions from years past. Carlos told me he had been driving this route for over 20 years and had heard similar phenomena before, usually late at night during the winter months. He said old-timers called them ghost channels, transmissions from drivers who had died in accidents but continued to broadcast from beyond the grave, trying to get help that would never come, or warn other drivers about dangers that no longer existed. I got back in my truck and continued toward Birmingham, but kept my CB radio tuned to channel 19 and several emergency frequencies. Around 2:30 a.m., I started picking up a conversation between two drivers using handles I had never heard before. One called himself Steel Thunder, and the other was Iron Eagle. They were discussing road conditions and fuel prices, but the details they mentioned did not match current reality. Steel Thunder was talking about diesel fuel being $1.20 per gallon and complaining about new emissions regulations that had been implemented years ago. Iron Eagle was warning about construction on a section of highway that I knew had been completed over a decade earlier. Their conversation sounded normal, except for these anachronistic details that suggested they were somehow broadcasting from the past. I tried to break into their conversation several times, but they did not respond to my calls. It was as if they could not hear transmissions from the present, only communicate with each other in whatever time period they were trapped in. Their voices were clear and distinct, not distorted by static like the earlier emergency calls, but there was something hollow and distant about the sound quality. Around 3 a.m., the radio traffic became more disturbing. I started hearing multiple voices calling out coordinates for accidents that I could not locate, warnings about road hazards that did not exist, and requests for assistance from drivers who seemed to be experiencing emergencies in real time. But when I or other drivers tried to respond, our calls went unanswered, as if we were broadcasting on different frequencies despite being tuned to the same channel. One transmission that particularly chilled me came at 3:17 a.m. A woman's voice, scared and desperate, came through the radio saying, "This is Lady Trucker, to anyone who can hear me." My truck went off the road at mile marker 186 and rolled down the embankment. "I am trapped in the cab and can smell gas leaking. Please send help immediately." The transmission was so clear and urgent that I immediately called 911 to report a possible accident. But when I reached mile marker 186, there was no sign of an accident. No skid marks, no disturbed guardrail, no emergency vehicles responding. The dispatcher I had called said they had no reports of accidents in that area and no record of any truck registered to the handle Lady Trucker currently operating on that route. As I continued south, the phantom radio traffic became more personal and threatening. Around 4 a.m., a voice that I did not recognize came through the radio addressing me directly. "Night Owl, this is Dead Man Walking. We know you have been listening to our transmissions. You need to stop eavesdropping on frequencies that do not belong to the living." My hands started shaking as I realized that somehow these ghostly voices were aware of my presence and were specifically targeting me. I tried to respond, asking who was broadcasting and what they wanted, but received only static in return. A few minutes later, the same voice came through again, this time with more detailed knowledge about me. "Night Owl, we know you drive the Memphis to Atlanta route every week. We know you live alone and have no family to miss you if something happened. You should find a different route to drive, because this highway belongs to us after midnight." I immediately changed channels, switching to channel 17 and then channel 21, but the threatening voice followed me to each frequency. No matter where I tuned the radio, Dead Man Walking seemed able to reach me with increasingly specific and disturbing messages about my personal life, my driving habits, and my route schedule. Around 4:30 a.m., the radio went completely silent except for one clear transmission that made my blood run cold. Dead Man Walking's voice came through crystal clear, without any static or distortion, saying, "Night Owl, check your mirrors. We are right behind you now." I immediately looked in my mirrors, but saw only empty highway behind me. No other vehicles were visible in either direction, and the road was well lit by overhead lights. But as I continued to scan my mirrors, I started noticing shadows that seemed to move independently of any physical objects. Dark shapes that appeared to be following my truck, but cast no reflection and left no trace. I grabbed my cell phone and called the state police, reporting the threatening radio transmissions and my growing fear for my safety. The dispatcher took my report seriously and said they would have patrol units check the area, but warned me that they had no way to trace or stop radio transmissions from unknown sources. Around 5 a.m., just as dawn was beginning to break, the phantom radio traffic suddenly stopped. The threatening voice of Dead Man Walking went silent, and normal CB chatter from living drivers began to return, but I was too shaken to continue driving. I pulled into a truck stop outside Birmingham and sat in the parking lot until full daylight, afraid to continue my route in case the supernatural stalkers returned. I spent the next day researching the history of Interstate 78 between Memphis and Birmingham, looking for information about truck driver fatalities that might explain the ghostly radio transmissions. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 30 years, more than 40 truck drivers had died in accidents on that stretch of highway, many of them during overnight hours when visibility was poor and fatigue was a factor. One case that particularly caught my attention involved a driver named Robert Deadman Walker, who had been killed in a multi-vehicle accident in 1998. According to newspaper reports, Walker had been broadcasting on CB radio channel 19 immediately before the crash, calling for help as his truck lost control and went off the road. His last transmission, recorded by other drivers in the area, was a plea for someone to tell his family that he loved them. I also found records of several female drivers who had died in single-vehicle accidents over the years, including one in 2003 whose handle was Lady Trucker, and who had been killed when her truck rolled over at mile marker 186, the exact location where I had heard the desperate call for help. The more research I did, the more I realized that the phantom radio transmissions were coming from drivers who had died on that route and were somehow still trying to communicate from beyond the grave. Some were calling for help that would never come. Others were warning about accidents that had already happened, and a few seemed to be trying to claim territory or drive away living drivers from routes they considered their own. I considered changing my regular route, but I had been driving that Memphis-Atlanta run for 7 years, and it provided steady, well-paying work. Instead, I decided to modify my radio setup and driving schedule. I installed additional CB radios tuned to different frequencies, started carrying a digital voice recorder to document any unusual transmissions, and began driving that route only during daylight hours when the phantom voices seemed to be less active. Over the next several months, I continued to pick up supernatural radio traffic on the overnight runs I occasionally had to make. The voices became familiar to me. Dead Man, walking with his threatening messages, Phantom Rider with his endless calls for assistance, Lady Trucker with her desperate pleas for help. I learned to recognize their transmission patterns and the times when they were most likely to be active. I also connected with other drivers who had experienced similar phenomena on various highways across the country. Through online forums and CB radio networks, I discovered that phantom transmissions are more common than most people realize. Drivers who die in accidents sometimes continue to broadcast on their radios, trapped in an endless loop of their final moments, or trying to warn others about the dangers that kill them. Some drivers told me they had learned to communicate with these ghostly voices, providing comfort to spirits who were trapped between worlds and helping them find peace. Others reported that acknowledging the phantom transmissions led to more intense and frightening encounters, as if the dead drivers became aware of the living and began to focus their attention on specific targets. I chose a middle path, neither engaging with the voices nor completely ignoring them. When I hear Dead Man walking making threats, I simply change channels. When Lady Trucker calls for help, I say a quiet prayer for her soul, but do not try to respond. When Phantom Rider reports accidents that do not exist, I note the location and time but continue on my route without stopping. The phantom radio transmissions have become part of my driving routine, a supernatural soundtrack to the overnight hours, when the highway belongs as much to the dead as to the living. I have learned to distinguish between normal CB chatter and ghostly broadcasts, and I have developed coping strategies for dealing with the fear and isolation that come from knowing I am sharing the airwaves with drivers who died years or decades ago. But the experiences have changed how I think about trucking and the brotherhood of drivers who spend their lives on the road. We are part of a community that extends beyond death, where the voices of those who came before continue to echo through the static, trying to help or warn or simply maintain contact with a world they can no longer fully inhabit. Every time I key my CB microphone now, I wonder who might be listening on the other side. Are there ghostly drivers monitoring my transmissions, learning my route patterns, and deciding whether to help or hinder my journey? The radio static that once seemed like mere background noise now feels like a doorway to another dimension, where the dead continue to drive eternal routes and broadcast messages that only a few living drivers can hear. If you're a driver who regularly runs overnight shifts, pay attention to your CB radio traffic. Learn to distinguish between normal communications and phantom transmissions. And remember, that the voices in the static are not just random supernatural phenomena. They are the spirits of drivers who once faced the same challenges and dangers that you face every night on the highway. The dead are still out there, still driving, still trying to communicate. Whether they are trying to help or harm depends on how you respond to their presence in your radio. But one thing is certain: once you start hearing voices in the static, you will never drive alone again. Sam, signing off, and remember to keep your radio tuned to the voices that matter, both living and dead. My name is Khaleesi, and I have been driving long haul for 9 years now. In that time, I have memorized every mile of my regular routes, every truck stop, every rest area, and every exit ramp between major cities. I know these highways like the back of my hand, which is why what happened to me in December 2023 still makes no sense and haunts me to this day. I was running a regular route from Phoenix to Denver, hauling electronics equipment for a retail chain. It was a route I had driven at least 50 times before, always taking the same path through New Mexico and Colorado. The timing usually worked out that I would cross through the mountains during daylight hours, but this particular trip was running behind schedule due to delays at the loading dock in Phoenix. I left Arizona around 6 p.m., which meant I would be driving through some of the most desolate stretches of highway during the overnight hours. This did not concern me initially. I had driven at night plenty of times before, and I actually preferred the reduced traffic and cooler temperatures. My truck was in good mechanical condition, I had plenty of fuel, and the weather forecast showed clear skies all the way to Denver. The first part of the drive went smoothly. I made good time through Arizona and crossed into New Mexico around 10 p.m. Traffic was light, and I was feeling alert and focused. I had my CB radio tuned to channel 19, listening to occasional chatter from other drivers, and everything felt normal and routine. Around midnight, I was somewhere between Albuquerque and Santa Fe when I started feeling the effects of the long day. I had been up since 5 a.m. dealing with the loading delays, and the combination of fatigue and the steady rhythm of highway driving was making me drowsy. I knew I needed to take a break before continuing into the mountains, where the winding roads would require more concentration. I started looking for a place to stop, scanning the highway signs for truck stops or rest areas. According to my mental map of the route, there should have been a large travel plaza coming up in about 20 miles, a place I had stopped at many times before. It was a well-known truck stop with good food, clean showers, and plenty of parking for overnight stays. But as I continued north, I did not see the familiar signs for the truck stop I was expecting. Instead, around mile marker 287, I saw signs for a place I had never noticed before. The green highway signs indicated Desert Oasis Travel Plaza, next exit, all services 24 hours. The name was not familiar to me, but after 9 years of driving, new truck stops did occasionally open along established routes. I took the exit and followed the access road toward what appeared to be a very well-lit facility. As I got closer, I was impressed by how modern and clean everything looked. The fuel islands were brightly illuminated. The parking lot was freshly paved, and the main building had large windows that showed a busy restaurant and convenience store inside. The truck stop was bustling with activity despite the late hour. There were dozens of trucks parked in organized rows, drivers walking back and forth between their rigs and the main building, and plenty of cars and smaller vehicles at the automotive fuel pumps. The whole place had an atmosphere of efficient, friendly service that reminded me of the best truck stops I had encountered in my career. I pulled up to one of the diesel fuel islands and began the process of fueling my truck. The pump worked smoothly, the price per gallon was reasonable, and everything seemed normal. While the fuel was flowing, I walked into the main building to grab some coffee and use the restroom. The interior of the Desert Oasis was impressive. The restaurant area had comfortable booths with clean upholstery, the convenience store was well stocked with everything a driver might need, and the staff members I encountered were friendly and professional. I ordered a cheeseburger and coffee from the restaurant, paid for my fuel and food, and decided this was a perfect place to take my mandatory rest break. After finishing my meal, I walked back to my truck and moved it to one of the designated overnight parking spaces. The lot was well lit and felt safe, with security cameras visible throughout the area and other drivers settling in for the night in their cabs. I set my alarm for 6 a.m., locked my doors, and closed the curtains in my sleeper berth. I slept better than I had in weeks. The parking lot was surprisingly quiet, despite all the activity I had seen earlier, and my truck stayed at a comfortable temperature throughout the night. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I felt refreshed and ready to tackle the mountain driving that lay ahead. I opened the curtains in my sleeper berth, expecting to see the familiar sight of a busy truck stop beginning its morning routine. Instead, I found myself staring at an empty field dotted with scrub brush and rocks. There was no truck stop, no other vehicles, and no signs of any human activity. My truck was parked on the side of a rural highway with no buildings visible in any direction. My heart started pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I climbed into the driver's seat and looked around more carefully. According to my GPS and the mile markers visible on the highway, I was parked at mile marker 287, exactly where I had taken the exit the night before. But there was no exit ramp, no access road, and definitely no desert oasis travel plaza. I checked my fuel gauge and found that my tank was still full, just as it had been after I fueled up the night before. I looked through my receipts and found the fuel receipt from Desert Oasis, clearly showing the purchase of 120 gallons of diesel fuel and $18.50 in food from their restaurant. The receipt looked normal and legitimate, with all the standard information about taxes and transaction details. But as I sat there examining the receipt more closely, I noticed something strange about the date. Instead of showing December 15th, 2023, the date on the receipt was listed as December 15th, 1987. The price per gallon of diesel was $0.98, which would have been accurate for 1987 but was impossibly low for 2023 when fuel was over $4 per gallon. I started my truck and pulled back onto the highway, my mind racing to find some logical explanation for what had happened. Maybe I had gotten confused about the location, or maybe I had stopped at a different truck stop than the one I remembered. But I had been driving this route for 9 years, and I knew exactly where I was. There had never been a truck stop at mile marker 287, and there was no physical evidence that one had ever existed there. I called the dispatch office on my cell phone and spoke to the dispatcher who had assigned me the load. I asked her if she had any information about new truck stops opening along my route, or if there were any facilities near mile marker 287 that I might have confused with somewhere else. She checked her databases and confirmed that there were no commercial facilities listed at that location, and no new truck stops had opened along that stretch of highway in over 10 years. I continued toward Denver, but stopped at the next truck stop I encountered to ask other drivers if they knew anything about a place called Desert Oasis Travel Plaza. Most of the drivers I talked to had never heard of it, but one older driver named Frank said the name sounded familiar. He thought he remembered a truck stop by that name from many years ago, but believed it had been closed down and demolished in the late 1980s. Frank gave me the name of a driver who had been running Southwestern routes since the 1970s, suggesting that if anyone would remember Desert Oasis, it would be him. I managed to contact this veteran driver, whose CB handle was Desert Rat, through the truck stop's courtesy phone. Desert Rat confirmed that there had indeed been a Desert Oasis Travel Plaza located near mile marker 287 back in the 1980s. According to him, it had been a popular stop for drivers running between Albuquerque and Denver, known for good food and friendly service. But the facility had been destroyed in a fire in December 1987, killing several employees and customers who were trapped inside the building. The fire had been caused by a propane leak in the restaurant kitchen that ignited during the busy overnight hours. Because the main exit was blocked by flames, many people had been unable to escape. The tragedy had made national news at the time, and the site had been deemed cursed by local residents. When the insurance company rebuilt the facility a year later, it never achieved the same level of success and eventually closed permanently in the early 1990s. Desert Rat said that over the years, other drivers had occasionally reported seeing the desert oasis late at night, usually when they were tired and looking for a place to stop. Some claimed to have actually stopped there, just as I had, only to wake up parked on the empty highway with no explanation for how they had gotten there. I asked Desert Rat about the date discrepancy on my receipt, and he said that drivers who claimed to have visited the Phantom truck stop always reported that detail. The receipts they received showed dates from 1987, the year the original facility was destroyed, and fuel prices from that era. Some drivers had kept these receipts as evidence of their supernatural encounter, but the receipts always faded or disappeared within a few days. When I checked my wallet the next morning, the receipt from Desert Oasis was gone. I had placed it carefully in my document folder, along with other trip paperwork, but it had vanished without a trace. All that remained was the memory of the experience and the knowledge that I had somehow interacted with a place that no longer existed in the physical world. I researched the history of Desert Oasis Travel Plaza when I got home and found newspaper articles about the 1987 fire that confirmed everything Desert Rat had told me. The articles included photographs of the burning building and interviews with survivors who described the terror of being trapped inside. 12 people had died in the fire, including 3 truck drivers who had been sleeping in their cabs when the explosion occurred. One of the articles mentioned that the victims had been ordinary people who were just trying to get some rest and a hot meal during their travels. They had no way of knowing that their stop at Desert Oasis would be their last. The tragedy seemed especially cruel because it had happened to people who were away from their families, alone on the highway, trusting in the safety and hospitality of a roadside business. I also found online forums where other drivers discussed similar experiences at various locations across the country. Phantom truck stops, ghost diners, and supernatural rest areas seemed to be more common than I had ever imagined. Some drivers theorized that these places continued to exist in some parallel dimension, serving travelers who were temporarily displaced from normal time and space. Other drivers suggested that the Phantom facilities were manifestations of the strong emotional connections that truckers develop with the places where they stop regularly. When a beloved truck stop is destroyed or closed, the collective memory and longing of thousands of drivers might be powerful enough to recreate it temporarily for those who need it most. Whatever the explanation, I know that I spent a night at Desert Oasis Travel Plaza in December 2023. More than 35 years after it was destroyed by fire, I ate food prepared by staff members who died decades ago, fueled my truck at pumps that no longer exist, and slept safely in a parking lot that is now an empty field. The experience changed how I think about the highway and the places where drivers seek rest and refuge. Every truck stop has a history, and some of them may continue to serve travelers long after their physical existence has ended. The bonds between drivers and the facilities that sustain us during our journeys may be stronger than death itself. I still drive the Phoenix to Denver route regularly, and I always slow down when passing mile marker 287. Sometimes, especially late at night when I'm tired and looking for a place to stop, I think I can see lights in the distance where Desert Oasis used to be. But I have never taken that exit again. I am grateful for the rest and safety the Phantom truck stop provided, but I'm not sure I want to risk another encounter with a place that exists outside normal time. The highway is full of mysteries that we may never fully understand. Some of them are dangerous, but others, like Desert Oasis, seem to exist to help drivers when they need it most. The 12 people who died in that fire in 1987 may still be serving travelers, providing the same hospitality and safety they offered in life. If you're ever driving through New Mexico late at night and you see signs for Desert Oasis Travel Plaza, you have to decide for yourself whether to take that exit. The facility may not exist in our world anymore, but it apparently still offers real food, fuel, and rest to drivers who need it. Just be prepared to wake up somewhere completely different from where you went to sleep. Khaleesi signing off, and remember that some truck stops serve travelers from more than one dimension. The desert oasis is still out there, still taking care of drivers who find themselves lost between yesterday and tomorrow on the lonely highways of the Southwest. My name is Camden, and I have been driving long haul for 12 years now. Most people think trucking is just about moving freight from point A to point B. But when you spend as much time on the road as I do, you become part of a community. We look out for each other through CB radio chatter, share information about road conditions, weather warnings, and sometimes just talk to combat the loneliness of those endless miles. My CB handle is Midnight Express, and I am known for my love of old country music and terrible jokes that I share over Channel 19. This story takes place in November 2022, during a routine run from Seattle to Atlanta. I had been driving for about 10 hours straight and was getting close to my mandatory rest period when I saw the familiar blue signs for a truck stop outside Little Rock, Arkansas. The place was called Big Rig Haven, one of those large complexes with fuel pumps, a restaurant, showers, and plenty of parking for overnight stays. I had stopped there before, and it always seemed like a decent, well-maintained facility. I pulled into the lot around 11:30 p.m. and found a parking spot toward the back where it was quieter. The place was busy, but not packed. Maybe 30 or 40 trucks scattered around the lot. I shut down my engine and grabbed my CB microphone to check in with other drivers who might be staying the night. The chatter was typical. Guys complaining about dispatch, talking about fuel prices, and sharing updates on traffic conditions ahead. After securing my load and doing my walk-around inspection, I decided to grab some dinner before settling in for the night. The restaurant inside was one of those generic truck stop diners with fluorescent lighting, vinyl booths, and a menu that offered everything from meatloaf to pizza. I ordered a cheeseburger and coffee, then found a booth near the window where I could keep an eye on my rig. While I was eating, I noticed this guy at the counter who seemed agitated. He was maybe 40 years old, medium build, wearing a dirty baseball cap and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He was arguing with a woman who appeared to be in her 20s. She had blonde hair and was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, but what caught my attention was how scared she looked. Her hands were shaking and she kept glancing toward the exit like she was planning to run. The argument was not particularly loud, and I could not make out what they were saying over the general noise of the restaurant. But their body language told a story. He was leaning in close, pointing his finger at her, while she kept backing away. Other customers were starting to notice too, but in typical truck stop fashion, most people minded their own business. You see a lot of domestic disputes in this line of work, and unless things turn violent, drivers usually stay out of it. After about 10 minutes, the woman suddenly bolted toward the bathroom. The man followed her, and I lost sight of both of them. I finished my burger and was getting ready to head back to my truck when I heard raised voices coming from the direction of the restrooms. Still, it was not my business, and I had an early morning delivery to think about. I walked back to my rig and climbed into the sleeper berth to get some rest. The truck stop had quieted down, with most of the restaurant traffic moving outside to the parking lot. I was just starting to doze off when I heard a woman screaming. It was not the kind of scream you hear during a normal argument. This was pure terror, the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of my cab to see what was happening. The screaming had stopped, but I could hear a diesel engine running somewhere across the lot. I started walking in that direction, my heart pounding, when I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. About 50 yards away, near the edge of the parking lot, a blue Peterbilt was pulling forward slowly. But there was something wrong with the picture. In the beam of a nearby security light, I could see what looked like rope or chain trailing behind the trailer. And at the end of that chain was the woman from the restaurant. She was still alive, still moving, but she was being dragged behind the truck. Her screams had turned to desperate, choking sounds as she tried to grab onto something, anything, to stop what was happening. The truck was moving at maybe 5 miles per hour, just fast enough to keep her from being able to get to her feet. I started running toward them, yelling for the driver to stop, but the truck began picking up speed. I could see the woman's body being torn apart by the asphalt, her clothes shredding, blood spreading across the pavement. The sound was horrific, like nothing I had ever heard before. By the time I got close enough to really see what was happening, she had stopped moving. The truck continued across the lot and pulled onto the access road that led to the interstate. I stood there in shock, my flashlight shaking in my hand, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The parking lot was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But there was a trail of blood leading from where the truck had been parked to the road, and the smell of diesel exhaust mixed with something much worse. I ran back to my truck and grabbed my CB radio, switching to the emergency channel. My voice was shaking as I called for help. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Midnight Express at Big Rig Haven Truck Stop, mile marker 128 on I-40. I just witnessed a murder. A woman was tied to a truck and dragged to death. I need state police immediately." The response was immediate. Other drivers on the channel started asking for details, and within minutes I could hear sirens in the distance. I stayed on the radio, providing a description of the blue Peterbilt and the direction it had gone. The license plate was too dirty to read clearly, but I had gotten a good look at the truck itself. It was an older model with custom chrome exhaust stacks and damage to the rear bumper. State police arrived within 15 minutes, followed by local sheriff deputies and an ambulance. I met them at the scene and walked them through everything I had witnessed. The blood trail was still visible, and there were pieces of clothing and worse scattered along the path the truck had taken. The officers were professional, but clearly shaken by what they were seeing. They took my statement, contact information, and asked me to stick around in case they needed additional details. I spent the next 3 hours answering questions, describing the woman, the man from the restaurant, and the truck. Security cameras from the truck stop had captured some of the incident, but the lighting was poor and the video quality was not great. What disturbed me most was what I learned from talking to other drivers who had been at the truck stop that night. Several of them remembered seeing the blue Peterbilt, but nobody could recall the driver. He had kept to himself, paid cash for fuel, and left without talking to anyone. The woman, however, had been seen talking to multiple drivers throughout the evening. According to witnesses, she had approached several truckers, asking for rides, claiming she needed to get to Memphis. Most of them had turned her down, either because they were not going that direction or because picking up hitchhikers violated company policy. But apparently, she'd found someone willing to help her, and that someone had killed her. The investigation revealed that the woman's name was Sarah Martinez, and she was 23 years old. She'd been reported missing from Oklahoma City 3 days earlier by her family. Somehow, she had made it to Arkansas, probably by hitchhiking, and ended up at that truck stop looking for another ride. The man I had seen arguing with her in the restaurant was never identified, and authorities could not determine if he was connected to her death or just another random encounter. But here is where the story gets even more disturbing. Over the next few weeks, as the investigation continued, police discovered that Sarah's murder was not an isolated incident. There had been similar killings at truck stops across the Southeast over the past 2 years. Women would disappear from truck stops, and their bodies would later be found along interstates, showing signs of having been dragged behind vehicles. The FBI got involved and started connecting the dots. They found at least 6 other cases with similar circumstances, all involving truck stops, all involving women who had been seeking rides from truckers. The killer was specifically targeting vulnerable women who were desperate enough to accept help from strangers. The investigation became a major operation, with law enforcement monitoring truck stops and putting out alerts to the trucking community. They released composite sketches based on various witness descriptions, but the details were inconsistent. Some described a man in his 40s, others said 30s. Some said he was tall, others average height. The only consistent detail was that he drove an older blue Peterbilt with chrome exhaust stacks. About 6 months after Sarah's murder, the killer was finally caught. His name was Dennis Franklin, and he had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years. He was arrested at a truck stop in Tennessee after another driver recognized his truck from the FBI bulletins and called police. When they searched his rig, they found evidence linking him to multiple murders, including rope, chains, and personal belongings from his victims. Franklin confessed to killing Sarah and 7 other women across 5 states. His method was always the same. He would approach women at truck stops who were looking for rides, gain their trust, then assault, and kill them in brutal ways. The dragging was his signature, something he did to send a message to other truckers who might try to help these women. During his interrogation, Franklin revealed that he had a deep hatred for women who hitchhiked or sought help from truckers. He saw them as immoral and deserving of punishment. He had been selecting victims carefully, choosing women who were alone, desperate, and unlikely to be missed quickly. His truck's CB radio was equipped with a scanner that let him monitor police frequencies, which helped him avoid detection for so long. The trial was a media circus, with prosecutors presenting evidence from 8 different murders. I was called to testify about what I had witnessed that night at Big Rig Haven. Sitting in that courtroom, describing Sarah's final moments, was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. Franklin showed no emotion during my testimony, just stared at me with these cold, empty eyes. He was sentenced to death and is currently on death row in Arkansas, but the damage he did goes far beyond the women he killed. The trucking community was shaken by the knowledge that one of our own had been preying on vulnerable people who were seeking help. It changed how many drivers view hitchhikers and people looking for rides at truck stops. As for me, I installed additional security cameras on my truck and started carrying a loaded pistol in my cab. I also became much more vigilant about suspicious activity at truck stops. The CB radio community developed new protocols for reporting dangerous individuals and sharing information about potential threats. But the most lasting impact has been the guilt I carry about Sarah Martinez. I keep thinking about those 10 minutes when she ran to the bathroom, and I chose not to get involved. If I had followed them, if I had confronted the man who was arguing with her, maybe she would still be alive. I know logically that Franklin would have found another victim, that I could not have known what was going to happen, but logic does not make the guilt go away. Every time I stop at a truck stop now, I scan the parking lot for blue Peterbilts. Every time I see a woman alone at a truck stop, I think about Sarah and wonder if she is safe. The road has always been a dangerous place, but Franklin's crimes reminded all of us that sometimes the greatest threat comes from within our own community. The trucking industry has implemented new safety measures since Franklin's arrest. There are better background checks for drivers, improved lighting at truck stops, and more security cameras. But predators like Franklin are experts at blending in, at appearing normal until they strike. I still love driving, still love the freedom and independence that comes with life on the road, but I will never again assume that every driver I meet is just trying to make an honest living. Some of them are hunters, and they see truck stops as hunting grounds where they can find vulnerable prey. The CB radio chatter is different now too. Drivers share more information about suspicious people and activities. We look out for each other and for the people who seek help from us. It is a responsibility that comes with the territory, but it is one that some drivers have twisted into something evil. Sarah Martinez was 23 years old when she died. She had hopes and dreams and people who loved her. She made a mistake by trusting the wrong person, but that mistake should not have cost her life. I think about her every time I drive past mile marker 128 on I-40, and I always will. My name is Braylon, and I am used to sleeping in my cab during mandatory rest periods. In 6 years of driving, I have parked overnight at hundreds of truck stops across the country, and I have learned to sleep through most of the typical noises. The hum of refrigeration units, the occasional slam of other truck doors, the sound of air brakes releasing when drivers start their engines in the morning. None of these things disturb my sleep anymore. But there is one sound that has been haunting me for the past 8 months. A sound so specific and deliberate that it wakes me up immediately every time I hear it. It is the sound of someone knocking on my truck, always at exactly 3:33 a.m., always with the same methodical pattern, and always when I'm parked at different truck stops hundreds of miles apart. The first time it happened was in March 2023 at a truck stop outside of Amarillo, Texas. I had been driving for about 10 hours and needed to take my mandatory rest break before continuing to Denver. It was a busy truck stop with good lighting and plenty of other drivers around, the kind of place where I felt safe parking for the night. I went through my normal routine of securing my load, checking my truck, and settling into my sleeper berth around midnight. I set my alarm for 10 a.m. and fell asleep quickly, tired from the long day of driving. But at 3:33 a.m., I was awakened by 3 loud, deliberate knocks on the driver's side of my truck. The knocks were spaced exactly 2 seconds apart, each one firm and precise, like someone was using their knuckles to rap on the metal door. I sat up in my sleeper berth and listened, thinking maybe another driver needed help or was trying to wake me for some emergency. But when I called out, "Hello?" there was no response. I looked out the window but could not see anyone near my truck. The parking lot was well lit, and there were other trucks nearby, but no people visible walking around. I assumed it was just another driver who had knocked on the wrong truck by mistake, maybe someone who was confused about where they had parked. I went back to sleep and did not think much more about it. But 2 weeks later, at a completely different truck stop near Oklahoma City, it happened again. Same time, 3:33 a.m., same pattern of 3 knocks, same spacing between each knock. This time I was more alert and responded immediately, jumping out of my sleeper berth and looking out all my windows. The parking lot was empty of pedestrians, and the nearby trucks appeared to have their drivers sleeping inside. I opened my driver's door and called out, "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" But there was no response. I walked around my entire truck, checking for any signs that someone had been near it, but found nothing unusual. No footprints in the gravel, no scratches on the paint, no indication that anyone had touched my truck. Over the next few months, the midnight knocking became a regular occurrence. It did not happen every night, but it happened frequently enough that I started to dread going to sleep. The time was always exactly 3:33 a.m. The pattern was always the same 3 knocks with 2-second intervals, and it always happened when I was parked at truck stops I had never been to before. I started keeping a log of each incident, noting the date, location, and any unusual circumstances. What I discovered was disturbing. The knocking was following me across multiple states, occurring at truck stops in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. It happened at large travel plazas and small mom-and-pop stops, at busy locations and isolated ones, but always when I was sleeping alone in my cab. The most unsettling aspect was the precision of the timing. I started setting my phone to record video at 3:30 a.m., hoping to capture evidence of whoever was knocking on my truck. But the recordings showed nothing. At exactly 3:33 a.m., clear audio of 3 knocks would come through on the recording, but the video showed an empty parking lot with no one visible near my truck. I began asking other drivers if they had experienced similar phenomena, mentioning it during CB radio conversations and at truck stop restaurants. Most drivers had never heard of anything like it, but a few shared their own stories of unexplained knocking or tapping sounds on their trucks during overnight stops. One driver named Carlos told me he had experienced something similar about 5 years earlier. According to Carlos, he had been awakened by knocking sounds for several weeks before he finally installed security cameras around his truck. The cameras captured audio of the knocking, but showed no physical presence causing the sounds. Eventually, the knocking stopped on its own, and Carlos never figured out what had been causing it. Another driver, a woman named Linda, said she had heard stories about the midnight knocker from other female drivers. According to these stories, the phenomenon targeted drivers who were alone and vulnerable, possibly as some kind of supernatural test or warning. Linda suggested that I try communicating with whatever was causing the knocking to see if it was trying to send me a message. I was skeptical about the supernatural explanations, but I was running out of rational theories. I had checked my truck thoroughly for mechanical issues that might cause knocking sounds, but found nothing. I had varied my parking locations and sleep schedules, but the knocking continued to occur at 3:33 a.m. regardless of where I was. In July 2023, I decided to try Linda's suggestion. The next time the knocking occurred, I was at a truck stop in Flagstaff, Arizona. At exactly 3:33 a.m., I heard the familiar 3 knocks on my driver's door. Instead of looking outside or trying to find the source, I knocked back 3 times on the inside of my door. The response was immediate and chilling. 3 more knocks came from outside, but this time they were louder and more insistent. I knocked 3 times again, and the exterior knocking became more aggressive, like someone was pounding on my truck with their fist instead of knocking with their knuckles. I tried speaking to whatever was outside. "What do you want?" I called out. "Why are you knocking on my truck?" The pounding stopped immediately, and there was silence for about 30 seconds. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, muffled and distant, came from outside my truck. It was difficult to understand, but it sounded like someone saying, "Let me in." I asked who was there and what they wanted, but there was no further response. The voice did not speak again, and the knocking stopped for the rest of the night. But the experience had escalated the situation beyond mere knocking. Over the next several weeks, the midnight visits became more intense and personal. The knocking would be followed by sounds of someone walking around my truck, testing door handles, and tapping on windows. Sometimes I would hear footsteps on the roof of my cab, as if someone was climbing on top of my truck. In August, the phenomenon reached a new level of intrusiveness. I was parked at a truck stop in Albuquerque when the 3:33 a.m. knocking began as usual, but this time, after I heard the 3 knocks, my truck's CB radio turned on by itself and began broadcasting static. Through the static, I could hear what sounded like whispered voices, too faint to understand, but clearly human in origin. The radio episode lasted for about 5 minutes, with the whispered voices becoming clearer, but no more comprehensible. It sounded like multiple people talking at once, all saying different things in languages I could not identify. Then the radio went silent and shut itself off, leaving me sitting in my sleeper berth, wondering what kind of forces I was dealing with. I decided to seek help from someone with more experience in supernatural phenomena. Through online trucking forums, I found contact information for a driver named Frank, who claimed to have expertise in paranormal experiences on the highway. Frank had been driving for over 20 years and had written extensively about ghostly encounters and unexplained events that truckers experienced. Frank listened to my story and told me that the midnight knocker was a well-known phenomenon among long-haul drivers, though most were reluctant to talk about it openly. According to Frank, the entity seemed to target drivers who spent a lot of time alone on the road, possibly feeding off their isolation and vulnerability. He explained that 3:33 a.m. was considered a supernatural witching hour, a time when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest. The specific timing of the knocking was significant, as was the pattern of 3 knocks, which had symbolic meaning in various occult traditions. Frank advised me to try different methods of protection, including keeping religious symbols in my truck, burning sage before going to sleep, and reciting protective prayers or mantras. He also suggested that I avoid engaging with the entity any further, as communications seemed to make the encounters more intense. I followed Frank's advice and placed a small cross on my dashboard, started carrying sage in my truck, and began saying a prayer before going to sleep each night. For about a month, the knocking stopped completely, and I thought the problem was solved. But in September, the midnight knocker returned with a vengeance. The knocking resumed at 3:33 a.m., but now it was accompanied by other phenomena. My truck's electrical systems would malfunction during the encounters, with lights flickering and the radio turning on by itself. Sometimes, I would wake up to find that items in my cab had been moved or rearranged while I was sleeping. The most disturbing incident occurred at a truck stop in Phoenix in October. I was awakened by the familiar knocking, but when I looked out my window, I saw a shadowy figure standing next to my truck. The figure was tall and thin, with no distinguishable features, like a person-shaped absence of light against the illuminated parking lot. The shadow figure stood motionless for several minutes, then began walking around my truck in a slow, deliberate circle. Each time it completed a circuit, it would knock 3 times on a different part of my truck. First the driver's door, then the sleeper, then the passenger door, and finally the back of the cab. I tried to record this with my phone, but the camera would not function properly during the encounter. The screen would flicker and show only static, and when I tried to use the flashlight, it would not turn on. It was as if the shadow figure was interfering with electronic devices, preventing me from documenting its presence. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 minutes, the shadow figure stopped circling and stood directly in front of my truck. It raised one arm and pointed directly at me, though I was inside my cab with the curtains drawn. Then it slowly faded away until it was completely gone and the knocking stopped. Since that encounter, the midnight knocker has continued to visit me, but the pattern has changed. Instead of occurring at random truck stops, the knocking now happens primarily when I am parked at locations where accidents or tragedies have occurred. It is as if the entity is drawn to places where death or trauma have left their mark on the landscape. I researched several of the truck stops where the most intense encounters have occurred, and discovered that many of them have histories of fatal accidents, violent crimes, or unexplained deaths. One truck stop in Colorado was built on the site of a former rest area where 3 drivers were murdered in the 1980s. Another location in Texas was the scene of a mass casualty accident that killed multiples truckers in the 1990s. This pattern suggests that the midnight knocker may not be a single entity, but rather a manifestation of the collective trauma and restless spirits that haunt certain locations along America's highways. The knocking may be an attempt by these spirits to communicate with the living, to seek acknowledgement or resolution for their unfinished business. I have learned to live with the midnight knocker, though the encounters still unnerve me. I no longer try to communicate with the entity or investigate the source of the knocking. When I hear those 3 deliberate knocks at 3:33 a.m., I simply acknowledge them silently and try to go back to sleep. The phenomenon has made me more aware of the spiritual history of the places where I park. Every truck stop, every rest area, every stretch of highway has stories of the people who have passed through, and some of those people may have left something of themselves behind. The road is not just a physical space for transportation. It is also a repository of human experience, including experiences that transcend death. I continue to keep my log of midnight knocker encounters, and I have connected with other drivers who have experienced similar phenomena. We share information about locations where supernatural activity is common, and we support each other through the psychological challenges of dealing with unexplained encounters. The midnight knocker has taught me that the highway is home to more than just the living. There are presences out there that continue to travel the same routes they followed in life, seeking contact with drivers who might understand their connection to the road. Whether these encounters are harmful or helpful remains unclear, but they are undeniably real for those who experience them. The next time you're sleeping in your truck and you hear 3 deliberate knocks at exactly 3:33 a.m., remember that you are not alone on the highway. The midnight knocker may be paying you a visit, adding your truck to its endless rounds of the American road network. Listen respectfully, but do not engage. Some visitors from beyond the grave are best acknowledged from a distance. Braylon, signing off, and remember that the highway never truly sleeps. The midnight knocker is still out there, still keeping its 3:33 a.m. appointments with drivers across the country. My name is Royalty, and in my 11 years of driving, I have built a reputation for being meticulous about paperwork and cargo security. I document everything, check and double-check my loads, and maintain detailed logs of every pickup and delivery. This attention to detail has served me well and helped me avoid the kinds of problems that can ruin a driver's career. But in February 2024, my careful habits could not explain what happened to a load that simply vanished while I was driving. The job came through my regular dispatcher on a Tuesday morning. It was a high-paying run from Los Angeles to Miami, transporting what the paperwork described as specialized industrial equipment for a technology company. The pay was exceptional, almost double what I would normally earn for a cross-country haul, but the client was willing to pay premium rates for guaranteed on-time delivery and enhanced security protocols. The pickup was scheduled at a warehouse complex in an industrial area of Los Angeles that I had never been to before. When I arrived at the address, I found a modern facility with tight security and professional staff. The loading dock supervisor, a woman named Jennifer, met me with a clipboard full of paperwork and very specific instructions about handling the cargo. According to Jennifer, I would be transporting a single sealed container that measured 8 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet high. The container was made of brushed aluminum and had no external markings or labels except for a small placard indicating it should be handled with extreme care. The paperwork listed its weight as 2,847 pounds, which seemed reasonable for industrial equipment of that size. The most unusual aspect of the job was the security requirements. I was instructed never to open the container under any circumstances, never to leave it unattended, and never to allow anyone else to inspect or handle the cargo. If I encountered any problems during transport, I was to contact a specific phone number immediately rather than calling my regular dispatcher. Jennifer also gave me a sealed envelope containing delivery instructions that I was not supposed to open until I reached Miami. She explained that this was standard protocol for high-security shipments, and that the final delivery location would be provided only when I arrived in the destination city. The container was loaded onto my trailer using a forklift, and I watched carefully as the warehouse crew secured it with heavy-duty tie-down straps and padding. The loading process was efficient and professional, and when it was complete, Jennifer walked around my trailer with a clipboard, photographing the container from multiple angles and documenting the security arrangements. Before I left the warehouse, Jennifer had me sign additional paperwork, acknowledging that I had received the cargo in good condition and accepting responsibility for its safe delivery. She also provided me with a special seal for my trailer doors, made of a high-tech material that would show any signs of tampering. The seal had a unique serial number that was recorded on my shipping documents. I left Los Angeles around noon and made good time heading east on Interstate 10. The truck felt normal, with the additional weight of the cargo noticeable but not problematic. I stopped for fuel in Arizona and did a routine inspection of my trailer and load, finding everything secure and properly positioned. The first night, I parked at a truck stop in New Mexico and slept in my cab as usual. Before going to sleep, I walked around my trailer and checked the special seal, which appeared intact and undisturbed. Everything seemed normal, and I had no reason to suspect any problems with the load. The second day took me through Texas, where I made another fuel stop and performed another inspection. The container was still securely tied down, and the trailer seal remained unbroken, but I started to notice that the truck felt different somehow. less heavy than it had when I left Los Angeles. I assumed this was just my imagination, or the result of driving through areas with different elevation and road conditions. On the third day, while crossing Louisiana, I became concerned that something might be wrong with the load. The truck was handling more like it was empty than like it was carrying nearly 3,000 pounds of cargo. When I stopped for fuel, I spent extra time checking the tie-downs and inspecting the container visually through the gaps in the trailer sides. The container appeared to be in the same position where it had been loaded, held securely by the straps and padding. But something about its appearance seemed different. The brushed aluminum surface looked duller than I remembered, and the container seemed to sit lower on the trailer deck than it had initially. I assumed this was normal settling that occurred during transport. That afternoon, I reached Miami and opened the sealed envelope containing my delivery instructions. According to the paperwork, I was to deliver the container to a warehouse in an industrial area near the airport. The delivery was scheduled for 8 a.m. the following morning, so I found a truck stop and prepared to spend the night before completing the job. Before going to sleep, I performed one final inspection of my cargo. The container was still in place, still secured by the tie-down straps, and the trailer seal was still intact. But the truck definitely felt lighter than it should have, and I was beginning to worry that something had gone wrong during transport. The next morning, I arrived at the delivery location at exactly 8 a.m. The warehouse was similar to the pickup facility, with professional staff and tight security procedures. The receiving supervisor, a man named David, met me at the loading dock with paperwork and began the process of unloading my trailer. But when David cut the special seal and opened my trailer doors, what we found was impossible to explain. The container was still there, still secured by the tie-down straps, still in the same position where it had been loaded 4 days earlier. But when the warehouse crew attempted to move it with their forklift, they discovered that it was completely empty. The container had no weight to it at all. It moved like an empty aluminum box, making hollow sounds when the forklift tines contacted it. When David opened the container's access panel, we found that the interior was completely empty, with no sign that it had ever contained anything. David immediately called the company that had arranged the shipment, while I called my dispatcher to report the problem. Both conversations were frustrating and confusing. The shipping company claimed to have no record of the load, and my dispatcher said the job had not come through normal channels, but had been arranged by someone claiming to represent my trucking company. The shipping company sent a representative to the warehouse within an hour. The representative, who identified herself as Sarah, examined the empty container and questioned both David and me about what might have happened during transport. She seemed as confused as we were about how industrial equipment weighing nearly 3,000 pounds could have disappeared from a sealed container. Sarah asked detailed questions about my route, my stops, and my security procedures. She examined my paperwork and photographed the empty container from multiple angles. But when I asked her about the nature of the original cargo and who had arranged the shipment, she became evasive and said she could not discuss those details. The situation became even stranger when Sarah told me that my payment for the job had already been processed and deposited into my account. She said the shipping company would handle the insurance claim for the missing cargo, and that I should not worry about any liability issues. This seemed unusual, since carriers are typically responsible for cargo that disappears while in their possession. I returned to my truck confused and concerned about what had happened. When I checked my bank account, I found that the promised payment had indeed been deposited, even though I had just delivered an empty container instead of the industrial equipment I was supposed to transport. Over the next few days, I tried to research the shipping company and the warehouse where I had picked up the load, but I could find no business licenses, websites, or other records for either facility. The addresses existed, but when I drove by them a week later, I found empty buildings with no signs of recent activity. The phone number Jennifer had given me for emergencies was disconnected when I tried to call it. The special trailer seal that had been provided turned out to be made of ordinary plastic, despite its high-tech appearance, And when I examined my shipping paperwork more carefully, I noticed that some of the details were inconsistent or appeared to have been altered. I contacted my trucking company's insurance provider to report the incident, but they told me there was no claim on file and no coverage issues related to the load. According to their records, I had never transported any cargo for the company mentioned in my paperwork, and there was no evidence that the job had ever officially existed. The most disturbing discovery came when I reviewed my bank statements from the previous month. The payment that had been deposited into my account after the delivery disappeared completely from my banking records 3 weeks later. It was as if the money had never existed, leaving no trace in my account or in the bank's transaction history. I tried to contact other drivers who might have had similar experiences, posting about the incident on trucking forums and asking around at truck stops. Most drivers had never heard of anything like it, but a few shared stories about mysterious loads that seemed to change or disappear during transport. One driver named Marcus told me about a load he had hauled 2 years earlier that seemed to get heavier during transport instead of lighter. According to Marcus, he had picked up a container of computer equipment that weighed 5,000 pounds according to the paperwork. But by the time he delivered it, the same container weighed over 8,000 pounds and contained equipment he had never seen before. Another driver, a woman named Patricia, described transporting a sealed container that appeared to change size during her trip. She said the container had measured 6 feet long when she picked it up, but was 8 feet long when she delivered it, despite being secured by the same tie-down straps in the same positions. These stories suggested that I was not the only driver who had experienced cargo that defied normal physical laws during transport. But none of us could explain how or why these phenomena occurred, or who was arranging these mysterious shipments. I began to suspect that my vanishing load was part of some kind of experiment or test involving technology that I did not understand. The high-tech appearance of the trailer seal, the professional security procedures at both facilities, and the substantial payment for the job suggested that serious resources were being devoted to these operations. Some possibilities I considered included experimental teleportation technology, interdimensional transport research, or classified government projects involving the movement of sensitive materials. The empty container might have contained something that was designed to disappear or be transferred to another location during transport. Another theory was that the entire job was an elaborate test of security procedures or driver reliability. Perhaps the container had never contained anything, and the weight I initially felt was created artificially to simulate a normal cargo load. The disappearance of the payment from my bank account suggested that the financial aspects of the job were also part of the deception. I also considered the possibility that I had been unknowingly involved in some form of smuggling or illegal transport. The cargo might have been transferred from the container during one of my stops, using techniques sophisticated enough to avoid detection. But this theory did not explain how the transfer could have occurred without breaking the special seal or leaving evidence of tampering. Months later, I'm still trying to understand what happened during that trip from Los Angeles to Miami. The vanishing load has made me more cautious about accepting unusual jobs, especially those that offer exceptionally high pay rates or involve mysterious shipping companies. I now research potential clients more thoroughly before accepting loads, and I maintain even more detailed documentation of my cargo inspections and security procedures. I also installed additional cameras and monitoring equipment on my trailer to provide better documentation of what happens to my loads during transport. But I have never encountered another job quite like the vanishing load. Whatever technology or technique was used to make that container's contents disappear, it was sophisticated enough to fool an experienced driver and leave no trace of how it was accomplished. The experience has taught me that there are aspects of the transportation industry that go beyond normal freight movement. Some loads may involve experimental technology, classified research, or other activities that push the boundaries of what is considered possible or legal. The highway is not just a network for moving conventional cargo from one place to another. It is also a testing ground for technologies and procedures that may not yet be publicly acknowledged, and drivers like me may sometimes be unwitting participants in experiments that we will never fully understand. If you are offered a job that seems too good to be true, with unusually high pay rates and mysterious security requirements, be prepared for the possibility that your cargo may not behave according to normal physical laws. The vanishing load taught me that not everything we transport stays in our trailers until delivery, and sometimes the most valuable cargo is the kind that leaves no trace of its passage. Royalty, signing off. And remember that some loads are meant to disappear. The question is whether we are moving cargo to its destination, or whether the cargo is using us to move itself to places we cannot even imagine.